Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Esther chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verse 8 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, chapter 2, verses 8 through 11 deal with Esther is taken to the king's house. All right? Esther now is going to be taken as one of the virgins to the king's house. So verse 8 says, And it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. Now, we need to understand that every virgin that was brought would eventually become the king's wife or his concubine, all right? But only one of those would be crowned as queen. So virgins now are being brought to Shushan for the king, and eventually they will be all his wives and or concubines, but one of them will be crowned as queen. Now, it says here Esther was brought also unto the king's house. Now, many commentators say that the Hebrew means that she was forcibly brought. All right? Also, that Mordecai tried to hide her from being taken. Now, that again, this is what some commentators think, is that they came, Mordecai tried to hide her or protect her, and he didn't want her to go, so they had to forcibly take her to the king's palace. But it is also seen by some commentators that she was not taken by force, and that it was actually be seen or be considered an honor for a Persian Jew to become even one of the king's concubines, if not the queen. So you can look at it both ways. And again, we have no proof of to which way it was, but is it possible she was forcibly taken? Yes. Is it possible that Mordecai let her go, and when the people from the king's palace came and saw her and wanted her, and Mordecai willingly let her go because it's seen in a sense as a position of honor, even if you weren't crowned as the queen, to be in the king's palace and to be provided for and protected by the king. So again, however you choose to see it, I think that basically they just came and they saw her, and did Mordecai, really want her to go? Probably not. But I don't think Mordecai, refused and put up a fight against the king's, the servants that came to get her. But I'm sure they were both sad to part, obviously. But I think, Mordecai let her go in a sense. So, and then it says, Esther was brought to the king's house. All right. Now, Esther is from a conquered and captive nation. And that which has been conquered is now seen as beautiful and as a candidate to be queen. Let me say that again. Esther comes from a conquered and a captive nation. The children of Israel were conquered by the Babylonians, and then eventually the Medes and Persians came and took the Babylonians over, right? And so the Jewish nation was a conquered nation. And that which has been conquered is now seen as beautiful and as a candidate for being queen. We also, every one of us, has been conquered by our heavenly King. And through the adornment of his perfect righteousness, through the blood of Christ, all that are brought to him become his children and the bride of his Son. As each virgin was brought to Shushan from all the provinces, so also we as conquered people, we go to our home in heaven, right? Through the blood of Christ, through his work on the cross. We've been conquered by our King. We willingly submit and give our lives to this King. And we are adorned. We are adorned by Christ. And we can now be presented to the King. Verse 9. And the maiden pleased him, and him meaning Haggai, pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her, out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids to the best place of the house of the women. Now, it says here, and the maiden pleased him, meaning Haggai, right? It was not only her beauty, but also her character which impressed Haggai. So she pleased him, not only in looks, but also in the way she carried herself. And it says that she obtained kindness from him. She obtained special favors from Haggai, of which we see in this verse. Now, what were the special favors that she received from Haggai? She received her things for purification. How? Quickly. Right? When Haggai saw her, he said, wow, I'm going to make sure she gets to the king as soon as possible, right? So she got her things for purification very quickly, right? Haggai wanted to present her to the king as soon as possible. And Haggai moved her and her 7 maidens to where? To the best part of the house, right? Haggai puts her and her 7 maidens into the best part of the house, right? Verse 10. Esther had not shown her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Now, there are differences of opinions as to why Mordecai told her this. She was never asked. She was never asked by anybody in the king's house where she was from. So she never really offered the information. And at this time, in the Jews' history, in the reign of the king Ahasuerus, there isn't any knowledge of persecution or any hard feelings towards the Jews. And we also see that the hand of God in this. For why should she give out information if she hasn't been asked for it, right? Conceal it if it's not necessary. So Mordecai tells her, more than likely as she goes, maybe as she's being taken by the men to the king's palace, or maybe shortly after she gets to the king's palace, Mordecai tells her, don't tell anybody you're Jew. And you understand, well, why? Well, because the Jews aren't being persecuted in the Medes and in the 127 province. They're not being persecuted. What would be the reason, right? Esther was never asked why, if she was, of what nationality she was from, so she never offered it. So again, the question comes up, why would you say that? But in the overall picture, we see God's hand in this, all right? Esther continued to obey Mordecai on this matter even after her marriage. Verse 20, after she's married with the king, verse 20 says, Esther had not yet showed her kindred, nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. So even after she's married to the king and she becomes queen, she still doesn't tell them who she is, but still, it's interesting, nobody there asks her, right? Nobody asks her of her nationality. Now, verse 11 says, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Now, Mordecai obviously had some sort of rank there at the palace. It is possible that he held some sort of position as a porter or as a doorkeeper to the main entrance of the city. Remember, it was at the king's gate that he heard the conspiracy to kill the king in chapter 2, verses 21 to 22. All right, it says here, chapter 2, 21 and 22 says, and in those days, while Mordecai sat where? At the king's gate. And then he hears this conspiracy. If you want, you can read verses 21 and 22. But Mordecai is at the king's gate. And it's believed he had some position, some job to do, some position of authority. Now, there are two other opinions as to why Mordecai had access to the place where Esther was, right? At the court of the women's house. The first opinion is this: because he was related to Esther and was granted permission to see her. All right, it's possible that because of his relation to Esther, he had the permission to see her when he wanted to. Or another opinion is this: that possibly Mordecai was a eunuch, and that he would have access to the house of the virgins. And because he was a eunuch, he must have had a high position in the king's service. Now, again, personally, I think that Mordecai, being a eunuch, is a little bit too much of a stretch of an idea. All right. But I think that this verse shows the great care and the concern that Mordecai had for Esther, making sure that she was taken care of. And he was there for her every day. Esther was probably a little scared as to what would happen to her. Being separated from friends and from Mordecai and from her familiar environment, right? She was probably a little bit scared. And now she's living in the king's house. She's got 7 maidens. I mean, you would think to yourself, wow, I'm not going to be scared. Sign me up for that, right? Well, back in those days, Mordecai was all she had. Her parents were dead. We don't know how many other friends she had. We don't know if she had any other relatives. But here, all of a sudden, the king's servants comes and takes her out of the house and takes her to the king's house. And it would be more reasonable to understand that she was probably a little bit disturbed, a little scared of what her future holds. And Mordecai was there. Mordecai was there for her. Like Mordecai, God will give us friends to support us and to encourage us as we go through changes in our life with God. We all need Mordecais in our life. And maybe in time, God will plan for your life to be like a Mordecai, right? Maybe God will plan for you to be a Mordecai to someone else, to encourage people to pray, to encourage people to read their Bible, to go to church, to go to Bible studies, right? Just to encourage people to keep on going with God. I mean, that's enough. That's enough, because we live in a world where Christians are falling away. They come to Christ, they love him, they get involved in the Word of God. And then through circumstances and through things going on in life, there's the temptations, the trials, and the things going on in this world, they fall away. And I'm not saying they're not saved anymore. They are saved. But the thing is that they need people to encourage them and in the things of God, just to encourage them to keep going with God. And maybe God will raise you up to be a Mordecai. Maybe you have Mordecais in your life. Mordecais that will come and encourage you and say, keep going. Keep going. You're with the king. It's all right. Your life is with the king now. Just keep serving him. Keep loving him, and he loves you, right? We're going to continue on in verse 12 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.